Coming up on the Mindful Midlife Crisis.
It really is a matter of just figuring out where the gaps are and filling those gaps in and getting comfortable enough to say, okay, I'm comfortable enough to go do this thing. If I got to get home, if I got to, have an out, what are those outs? And shit's going to happen no matter what at some point in your life. You're not going to be able to script when stuff goes wrong. You just kind of got to be ready for, prepare for the worst, hope for the best, I guess.
Welcome to the Mindful Midlife Crisis, a podcast for people navigating the complexities and possibilities of life's second half. I'm your host, Billy Lahr, an educator, personal trainer, meditation teacher, and overthinker who talks to experts who specialize in social and emotional learning, mindfulness, physical and emotional wellness, cultural awareness, finances, communication, relationships, dating, and parenting, all in an effort to help us better reflect, learn, and grow so we can live a more purpose-filled life. Take a deep breath, embrace the present, and journey with me through the Mindful Midlife Crisis. Our guest today is Jason Robinson. As a working class kid from Ohio, Jason didn't realize that moving away from his home state was an option until he was in his 20s. But as he got older, he realized that unless he wanted to end up a cranky old man with twisted secondhand perceptions of the world, he figured he better start traveling solo. So as a result, Jason adopted an experiment mindset to tackle the unknowns of long-term nomadic travel and how to make a living while on the road. He eventually transitioned to being a location-independent nomad, earning his income by being a freelance designer and writer. At the age of 42, and during the COVID pandemic, Jason was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. He remains dedicated to motivating and inspiring others to push their comfort zones, but he now includes how to navigate living nomadically while managing a major medical condition. Jason also recently published and designed The Beginner Traveler's Guide to Going Nomad, a hands-on guide full of tough love, tips, and strategies to help you finally kickstart a life of travel or go fully nomad. We will link that in the show notes. Welcome to the show, Jason Robinson.
Glad to be here. It's been a while. We've been trying to do this.
Yeah. You know what's cool, and we'll probably talk about this too, but one of the ways that we connected is that you spent some significant time in Portugal right after I did, and you were in Porto, and Porto is one of my favorite cities. I can only imagine you also fell in love with Porto.
Yeah, Porto, Portugal in general, but I spent a lot of time in Porto, and I was in Lisbon for about 6 weeks, and then 7 or 8 other, smaller towns. So yeah, you and I were bouncing ideas back and forth. You were giving me some hints on where to go and what to look at. And so, yeah.
Yeah. There's just something magical about Portugal. There is no bluer sky in the world that I have ever seen. It's just absolutely fantastic. So I'm glad that you got to experience that. And that's one of the things that we're going to discuss today. But before we get into that, we always ask our guests what 10 roles they play in their life. So Jason, what are the 10 roles that you play in your life?
Let's see. I'm a deep thinker, a traveler, an artist, student, writer, a Renaissance man, a nerd, gamer, a tinkerer, a dream pusher, and of course, a type 1 diabetic.
We're going to talk about the type 1 diabetes later on in the show, but I want to talk about this Renaissance man for a second right here. I imagine being a Renaissance man lends itself well to being a digital nomad.
Yeah, so I guess to define for those that might not know that kind of antiquated term, a Renaissance man is defined as someone, I don't think it needs to be a man, but somebody who is multi-versed in many different things and many different, I don't want to say talents, but competencies maybe. Yeah, just growing up, I had so many influences and they all kind of taught me to do what felt right with my heart or my soul. And it didn't matter whether that was something that was very masculine or very feminine or however those were defined years past. And what happened was I just became very well rounded. So, I'm just as comfortable going to the opera or going to a musical or gutting a bathroom and rebuilding and contracting or, writing some poetry or things like that. So all of those things do tie in well to being a nomad because especially, an entrepreneurial nomad, because you do have to just figure out a lot of different things. And, especially with this kind of experimental mindset, go in a few different directions and, go down some different paths that you may have never gone down before. So yeah, you get a lot of different new competencies, and having a lot of in your toolbox also helps.
Well, and we're going to be talking about that experiment mindset too. So we'll circle back around to that because I like that idea of being a Renaissance man, a Renaissance person, making you more well rounded so that you are more inclined to put yourself out there and experience different things in life. One of the three roles that you're most looking forward to here is tinkerer, and you already kind of hinted at that. What are you tinkering with today or lately?
Literally lately, I've been rebuilding the bed that's in the back of my four-door Jeep. I built out my Jeep 4 or 5 years ago when I started going, nomadic in the United States and overlanding a little bit. So I built that out with very little knowledge, just, looking at some YouTube videos and figuring some things out. I rebuilt a new bed 2 years ago and it was like 10 times better. I had some new ideas and I had a little bit of time here in Michigan, where I'm hunkered down for a little bit. And I was like, I'm ready to try something new. So I literally just finished my new bed in the past couple of days and getting ready to kind of move everything back into it. And so, yeah, I enjoy looking at things and seeing if I can make them a little bit better or a little bit different, and if not, just learning from that process.
So are you fully embracing van life here then?
So part of my, and again, we'll get into the experiment mindset. One of my experiments 4 years ago was I literally bought a 1986 Chevy G10 conversion van that was already, ready to go hit the road. And I actually went and spent a week or two in national parks, camping and working out of my van to see if I liked that idea. And I did. The van was a piece of shit. And it was getting 12 miles per gallon. I didn't know whether it was going to get over the next hill. It was a mess, but it did give me enough insight to say I really do like that ability to have my whole life with me and go boondock and check out places that people don't get to check out when you're just car camping and doing those types of things. So I will get back. I will likely own a van sometime in the next 5 years. But currently, I own my Jeep, and that's a good stopgap. And I can sleep in that. I can travel in it. I've built it out quite well to be functional. And so that'll do for the time being, especially since a lot of my travel right now, I'm trying to get out of the country and experience new cultures and things like that.
For those who don't know, I used to have a co-host by the name of Brian on the Bass, and Brian and his wife bought a bus. You can actually follow that on Instagram at We Just Bought a Bus. And they gutted it all out and they turned it into a camper. They call it a schoolie, I guess. I guess this is just a movement that's out there. And it's absolutely amazing just the work that they put into it. So, he reminds me of you, Brian, is very much a Renaissance man and a tinkerer like you as well. And you've brought up this idea of traveler. It sounds like you want to get back abroad. Where do you want to go? What are some places that you want to see? Where have you also been here recently?
So we'll get into the story of my travels, but I only saw my third country outside the US 3 years ago. So 40 years old, I saw my third country, and I'm 44 right now. I might be getting a year or two off there, but essentially, I bought a one-way ticket to Mexico to test the waters of digital nomadism and see how far I could go living on a backpack. And that was really my first foray out of the country, other than Canada and London, when I was 25 years old. So I haven't seen a lot of places. And the way I look at it, I don't care where I'm going if the weather suits my personal preferences and it doesn't make me miserable, and I can experience some new people and see a new place. So that said, I've spent time in Middle and Western Europe. I'm just, I was back in Portugal at the beginning of this year for 3 months, or at the end of last year. And then I'm getting ready to head to Spain for 3 months in a few weeks, a couple weeks here. So honestly, I want to follow 70 degrees for the rest of my life because I know that that's my comfort zone, and that's not, that's maybe a privileged mindset. But in reality, I've just done the work to know where I'm most comfortable, where I'm most productive, where I can get a lot of work done, where I thrive. And it is in that temperature range. And that's kind of how I start to choose where I want to go. Obviously, there's some places that don't have those temperatures, and I will want to get to all those places too. It's just a matter of, which time of year am I going to go?
Yeah. Yeah. I always look at Iceland and I'm like, okay, what small window am I going to go and travel to Iceland? Because I definitely want to see that. When we had Dr. David DeMarcus on, he has been there and the pictures that he posts are just amazing. My friend Eric has posted amazing pictures. My friend Elizabeth lives in Iceland right now. And the videos that she posts is like, okay, I need to get there sometime. But what's the 2 to 3 month window right here? You sounds like you're living the dream and you want to be a dream pusher as well here in the second half of life. So what do you mean by that? What does that look like for you?
Dream pusher for me is better than a drug dealer. It's a dream pusher.
I was thinking that too, and I'm like, dream pusher, drug pusher.
It
I
is,
guess.
I really I get inspired when people tell me what they want to do, but then they tell me why they're not going to do it or why they think they're unable to do it. And I really try to encourage them to look at things a different way or to problem solve and to figure out how to do those things. Because I think, speaking from my past experience as well as my experiences with other people, because my life has seen a lot of different chapters, I think that a lot of people get a little bit tunnel visioned. They get scared by financial issues, by medical issues, and they kind of hunker down into a safe space. And anything outside that becomes really scary. But I think, once you start to open people up to maybe this experiment mindset where you just chunk off a little bit here and a little bit there and then take a step back and look at it and say, okay, what can I do next? We just have so much time left in front of us. You think about the fact that I'm 44 years old. I'm not sure exactly how old you are, but let's take somebody who's 30 years old. We were told to kind of figure your stuff out, have your picket fence in your house by the time you're 30, or else you're failing at life or something like that. That 30-year-old has only been thinking like a grown ass adult for about 10 years of their life. If they went to college or didn't, 18 to 24 years old, they're partying a lot. They're doing these things that are transitional. So really, if you're 30 years old, you've really only had 10 years or so of upright thought that's really pushing you forward. And you now have 30 to 40 to 50 years in front of you. The percentage behind you is so much smaller than this percentage in front of you. So yeah, I think, I just really enjoy pushing people to figure out a way to go after these things. So, whatever my platform becomes, obviously I wrote a book to try and get people to travel more and to break down those barriers. And, whatever that comes one of these days, I just want to encourage people to keep pushing their momentum forward instead of letting it stagnate, I guess.
Well, let's do this. We're going to take a quick break. And then when we come back, we're going to do a deeper dive into this experiment mindset and how Jason has applied this and approached this in his own life and what suggestions he has for you as a dream pusher. Thank you for listening to the Mindful Midlife Crisis. Thank you for listening to the Mindful Midlife Crisis. If you're enjoying what you've heard so far, please do me a favor and hit the subscribe button. Also, giving the show a quick 5-star review with a few kind words helps others find and benefit from this podcast just like you are. Finally, please spread the wealth of free knowledge and advice in this episode by sharing it with the people in your life who may find this information and my mission to help others live a more purpose-filled life valuable. My hope is that these conversations resonate with others and inspire people to live their best lives. Thanks again. And now, back to the show. Welcome back to the Mindful Midlife Crisis. We are here with Jason Robinson. You can follow him on Instagram at the Nomad Experiment. You can also go to his website at www.thenomadexperiment.com. He's got a book there that you can get. It's called The Beginner Traveler's Guide to Going Nomad. You can check that out. And we're going to talk about this experiment mindset here. Jason, we talked last week or a couple of weeks ago here, and you and I have a lot of similarities. You're 44, I'm 45. We've been doing this traveling here quite a bit. We found out that we're both from small towns in the Midwest, and that neither of us started traveling overseas until our late 30s. I was 37 before I got a passport. What do you think it is about growing up, particularly in small Midwest towns, that makes travel seem so out of reach?
Yeah, I can only speak for myself. So obviously these are my own opinions, but for me, it was two major things. It was financial. We just never had the money to do much. So we were hiking, we were camping, and we thought, we were pigs in shit, that was great. But we didn't necessarily know that there was all these options out there as far as travel, because that would just seem too expensive. Or, because my family was a one income household, my dad was working overtime every week. He gets us 2 weeks a year. We go do things during those windows. So, there was that financial aspect of it and those realities. But then there was also kind of the thought silos that you get into as your sphere of influences becomes smaller. You're only getting the ideas from that bubble of influence. And I wasn't around a lot of travelers. I wasn't learning about the ability to do travel for what I would consider less expensive than staying here in the United States and doing that. So it just wasn't factoring into my thought process. So yeah, we never traveled outside the US. I remember getting ticked because my sister got to go to Phoenix when she was like 16. She got to go on an airplane and go to Phoenix, Arizona. And I never got to go on a trip on a plane whenever under 18 years old. So I think I still, hit my dad with that one every once in a while. Like, man, you still owe me a trip to Phoenix or something.
I know for me, I grew up on a farm, and my sisters would be the first to say, you didn't do anything on the farm. And it's like, I fully admit that because I was the youngest. I just played sports and I got away with everything. But, when we would do vacations, a Lahr family vacation meant that we would rent a cabin in my hometown of Sauk Center so that we could still get to the farm and take care of the cows in the morning and the evening, that kind of thing. So I feel like that prevented us from ever taking trips. I mean, it was a huge deal. We went to Epcot or whatever when I was in fourth grade, but we went because it was one of those timeshare presentations that we went to. So I remember as a kid sitting through this timeshare presentation, I'm like, where's Mickey Mouse? Like, this is so lame right here. And I just didn't embrace traveling when I was younger. And I'll be honest, I was scared to travel. Were you ever scared to travel?
Well, that was the other, probably line of thinking was that, travel outside the United States was dangerous, or that other countries just weren't safe for travel. So I think that was another thing that factored into it, was the, maybe the political bent, or just the generational, the history of my family passed down to the next people in our family, and whatever was thought in the previous generations is still thought. So, breaking down some of those barriers and rewriting those misconceptions later on in life is what I needed to do once I started to open my eyes a little bit more.
Well, and you've talked about not wanting to be a cranky old man with secondhand perceptions of the world. And you just said these things get passed down from generation to generation. When you look back on your perceptions of the world when you were in your 20s and in your 30s, what were some of those perceptions and how have they evolved through experimentation? You talked a little bit about how the perception that the world is dangerous outside of the US.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the big ones is, unfortunately, we always had and maybe still have these negative, in my opinion, misconceptions of Mexico. And, it's easy, low hanging political fodder because they're just to the south of us. So, that was one perception, was, that Mexico was this dangerous place and you shouldn't be going there unless you go to a resort. But then I do think that just extended by default to other countries. So, that was just, I don't know whether that was just the news or whether that was anything that, I was hearing around me, but that was what was kind of ingrained in my brain. So it was media, it was the news, it was politics, but they were never my own actual ideas. They were ideas that I picked up from somebody and I had no proof of, but I started to own them. And I think a lot of people, if you really look at yourself in your 20s and early 30s and say, is this my idea or is this somebody else's idea that I've not validated? And that's what I did in my mid 20s. I started realizing, I actually had a friend who, he's still a coworker of mine. He and his girlfriend in Charlotte, when I lived in Charlotte, they came into work. He came into work and he's like, hey, we're going to sell everything and go travel Europe for as long as our money takes us. And we're just like, excuse me. And he was dead serious. They had a sticker sale at their condo and they literally put stickers on everything and they sold everything. They got together $18,000 and then they went and traveled Europe together for, it was 8 to 10 months for two of them on $18,000. And they did couch surfing, they did hostels. They met people in bars and stayed at their houses. And he was one of those early bloggers about it, but his was a very financial mindset blog. And they literally detailed down to every single penny that they spent. So I got to start seeing not only these amazing experiences with these people that, were clearly foreign to me, but the misconception that travel costs so much money, and they were having these amazing, amazing experiences on literally $20 or $30 a day. And we've all heard that now, because we see bloggers doing that. But, back then that was novel to me. And I had first person experience because he was a friend of mine. He was there in the flesh with me. And then all of a sudden, a week later, he was over in Europe and they were traveling, westward. So that was really where I started to see the difference in my reality compared to what reality might actually be. And then I kind of started saying, okay, on something. And that was when I was 28, 29 years old, I think is when he went. So still pretty late that I was even starting to break down some of those mental barriers.
Well, and I think when we talk about an experiment mindset, and if people are thinking, you know, travel is expensive, and, yeah, it can be, but it doesn't have to be, that sort of thing. There's an approach to managing your money that you can take if you want a bit more experiment mindset, or if you are willing to really be regimented. And that's something that you decided to do because you dug yourself out of $50,000 worth of debt in your 30s through simple but effective budgeting. So, what did that look like for you so that you could embrace this bigger sense of independence and take on more experiments?
So to be clear, this had nothing to do with my future of travel. This had, the reason I got out of debt was, I was in a relationship whenever I was 28 years old. I thought that relationship was going to be ending up in marriage and potentially, adopting kids or having kids. And that ended. And I was not the one that ended that. So I was kind of like hit by a bus. And I said, and I realized that person was much more financially stable than I was. And I realized that had we gone down that path and gotten married and started a family, and then if something would have happened to her, our main financial means, or, somebody who was financially solvent and I wasn't, if something happened to her, then we would be destroyed. Like it wouldn't work. And I realized, okay, if I ever get in this position again where I am with somebody that I want to spend my life with, I do not want to be the one that brings that kind of stress and potential negativity to that relationship. And that was literally the reason, that I went out, bought a couple of books on budgeting, and very soon after buckled my life down like nobody's business. My beer budget, my entertainment budget was $10 every 2 weeks. That included beer out at a bar. Like I was locked down. I told everybody around me, look, this is happening. This is what I'm doing. I didn't buy gifts for people at Christmas. I still don't. That's a whole nother story. So that was the start of my end of this consumerism mindset that we tend to get in. But yeah, I literally said, I can do this for as long as I need to do this because I've seen what it's like to be $50,000 in debt and crushed by that stress. And I want to see what it's like to not have that. And by the time I was 32 years old, I paid off everything, and I've lived debt free since then. And that doesn't mean I'm rich. I don't make a lot of money. I never have. It's kind of the point. I was in debt. I wasn't making a lot of money, but now I can actually see both sides of that coin. And, you made me think about something a few minutes ago. The experiment mindset is, yes, let me decide to do something. It's a decision of, I'm going to try this thing. What I think is very important before you even get to that point is figure out whether your ideas of something are actually correct. Because we talk about travel doesn't have to be expensive. Well, there's a lot of people that say, well, I could just never do that. I could never stay in a hostel. Well, why? I don't know. I just couldn't do it. Okay, I've been there. I want to take that easy answer. But in reality, unless you have hard facts on why you can't do this thing, why you really shouldn't, or why it's unsafe, and you have like cold hard facts from somebody that or somebody that's experienced this, not just some outside source that comes to you one day from the TV or from this other thing, I think that's the first step in breaking down some of your barriers towards potential goals that you might want, is to really look at the hard facts about those things. We spend so much money on things that are wasteful, whether it's, for lack of a better example, the coffee that you have 4 days a week that costs you $6. That's no longer a reward whenever we do it 6 or 7 days a week. Now I reward myself 1 or 2 days a week, and I say, you know what, you're going to go work, but you're going to do it in a coffee shop so you can spend $7 because you're going to be making money while you're doing that. I'm not going to go do it just because I'm pissy and I want my coffee, and that's a $7 coffee. So I think, there's just some misconceptions that we have personally about ourselves, and then we have about the world, that we need to break down and say, are these real, or can I adjust? So I did a lot of those things, and kind of took a look at what I was doing, and I was like, you don't need this motorcycle, you don't need this extra things that you justify because of your quarter life crisis or something like that. Get rid of those things, reevaluate what's working, and then on the other side of that, like I said, when I got to 32, that 4 years of changing the way that I handled my money very much changed the way I moved forward from there.
Well, you bring up an interesting point right there, because if you are thinking about, I'd like to live a bit more minimally, or I'd like to be better at conserving my money, does it have to be, oh, I need my coffee? Okay, okay, fine. You need your coffee in the morning to start the day. That's another conversation that I could have with people. But do you need that coffee? Does it have to be that coffee, or just have you grown accustomed to it? Because you said maybe that just becomes the treat, right? That's how you treat yourself. So you just get it 1 day a week and you drink coffee black or what have you. And I don't drink coffee, so maybe I don't have any stake in this game or anything like that. But, I think about those things where, like, for me, I really don't drink alcohol anymore at all. Like, when I was teaching, I would do the entire school year sober. I would do sober school years. And then when I would in the summer have a drink, it was maybe once every week or two. Like, it was not a priority for me. And that saved a lot of money. Now, I wish I could learn how to do that with eating out at restaurants. And I think, I have to get better at cooking for myself. And I think there's a loneliness component to that I fully admit to right off the bat. But I think what you just talked about there addresses this other question that I was going to ask you about. There might be people listening who say, well, I don't care to travel. I have no interest in that. So then how does one apply this experiment mindset if traveling isn't of interest? But I think you kind of talked about that with digging yourself out of finances. That's another example.
So I think let's add to this misconceptions thought the word fear. So I think those are two things that we battle internally. We battle our own misconceptions. We battle a misconception about the goal we're trying to get to, and how, we start filling in these gaps with what we think it would look like or what we think we might have to do. And once again, when you start to break it down to facts and say, no, these are actual things I need to do. Let me go find somebody who's done this and find out what they did. And then I can say, oh, now I actually have true facts of what these things are to do. Well, the other side of that is fear. So I think, in writing this book about, it's called The Beginner Traveler's Guide to Going Nomad. But what it really is breaking down fears of a thing and breaking down hurdles to a thing and saying, okay, let's look at this. Let's evaluate it. Let's take the low hanging fruit and start plucking that off the tree. And then that's going to lead me to the bigger fruit later on, because I've gotten more comfortable with that process. So, for instance, there's a chapter in this book about what's stopping you from traveling to other countries. What are you fearful of? And then there's 20 or 30 different things. Maybe it's getting murdered. Maybe it's getting kidnapped. Maybe it's getting your stuff stolen. Maybe it's missing your family events back home. It's all these different things. And you rate all these things 1 to 10. And then all of a sudden you have this list of, oh, well, I've looked at all the angles, and these are the 5 things that seem to be holding me back the most. And these are the ones that aren't. So it's a matter of really looking at what you want to get and finding out where the fears are, where the misconceptions are, and then starting to break those down and say, let me pick off one at a time. It's setting small goals, one step in front of the other, and doing it. But it's also a lack of complacency. we can often get in a funk and we can say, you know what, I'm just going to hunker down for 2 or 3 weeks. That turns into 2 or 3 months, and it turns into 2 or 3 years. So it's also, checks and balances, getting people that are around you trying to accomplish similar things and helping you do those things. So there's a lot of things you can do to, you know, have this experiment mindset in your life. But, it's accountability, it's being real with yourself. There's that tough love aspect to it. Like, you're the one that can call you on your own bullshit. So do it, that's a good start right there. Yeah, I do it every day. So
Well, it reminds me of the conversation that we had with John Wessinger. I think that's like episode 31, where he reassesses our relationship with risk. And I think you hit it on the head there, is just taking a look at, what is it that you fear? I imagine being diagnosed with type 1 diabetes instilled some fear in you. So let's do this. We're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to talk to Jason about how he manages his type 1 diabetes while living that nomadic lifestyle. Thank you for listening to the Mindful Midlife Crisis. Thank you for listening to the Mindful Midlife Crisis. New episodes come out every Wednesday to help you get over the midweek hump. If you'd like to contact me, or if you have suggestions about what you'd like to hear on the show, visit www.mindfulmidlifecrisis.com and click Contact Us. While you're there, don't forget to sign up for the newsletter. You can also click on the show notes for links to the articles and resources we reference throughout the show. If you want to check out my worldly adventures, follow me on Instagram at mindful_midlife_crisis. My hope is that my trials, tribulations, and successes will inspire you to take intentional action to live a more purpose-filled life. And while you're at it, remember to show yourself some love every now and then, too. Thanks again. And now, back to the show. Welcome back to the Mindful Midlife Crisis. We're here with Jason Robinson. We're talking about experiment mindsets. You can follow him on Instagram at the Nomad Experiment, or you can go to www.thenomadexperiment.com. He's got a book there called The Beginner's Traveler Guide to Going Nomad. You can check that out. So, Jason, one experiment that you had to start managing and living with was being diagnosed with type 1 diabetes in the last year or two. So I imagine, you talk about tinkering, right? You're tinkering with your health, and that's a precarious thing to be tinkering with. Talk about that process, what you've learned about yourself during this time, what you've learned about type 1 diabetes. It sounds like you now have an encyclopedic knowledge of type 1 diabetes that your doctors are even impressed with. And how does that present a challenge to you for your digital nomad lifestyle?
That is a very kind way of putting it. I would never think that, because type 1 is something that, my endocrinologist has had it for 20 years. And he literally looks at me and he goes, dude, I don't understand why my body was doing what it was doing yesterday. And I've had this for 20 years. So there's so much to learn about this, but I digress. So quick recap. I sold my house in 2019, and I hate to date things, but 2019, in May of 2019, I went over to Europe for 2 months. I came back home. I went to Mexico for 2 months, and I was really starting to live that digital nomad life where I was working on the road and experiencing new countries and really spending time in those places. So I was in Mexico for 2 months in one place, and I really got to immerse myself. That's the way that I like to travel. And then literally March, COVID happened, came back from Mexico in the beginning of that. And then 6 months later, I was hunkered down in Michigan with some friends and diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. So 42 years old, I'm 44 years old now. So in the middle of that pandemic, barely a year after I had sold everything in my life and gone fully nomadic, I got hit with this. My body changed at the beginning of that. So where my eyesight changed. I was drinking a gallon of water a day. I was going to the bathroom every hour. I was taking 4 or 5 naps a day. I lost 20 pounds in a little over a month. I weigh 165, so there ain't a lot to lose there. So I was down to 144. One of my best friends said that I looked skeletal. She told me that after I was diagnosed. She didn't say anything. I'm like, really? You didn't want to tell me that I looked that bad? Like, the first 10 pounds, I was like, sweet, I finally learned how to lose weight. And then the next, 10 pounds, I was like, there's a problem here. So I was diagnosed, and, I'm single at the time. I went to the doctor by myself, kind of knowing that it was diabetes at that point. But then that's a really weird thing because I really did know at that point. I left Michigan and I said, hey, I got some doctor's appointments in Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm pretty sure it's diabetes. I'm going to go prove it. And, but I wasn't changing anything. Like I wasn't looking up what is diabetes and what should I be looking at. It was really weird. Like there was this suppression of reality already starting before I was professionally diagnosed, where I was just kind of like I don't know, I was just ignoring it already. So anyways, I got diagnosed and like everything just shut down. Like I literally lost my shit for like 2.5, 3 weeks and couldn't produce anything. I was just lost because I thought that this whole life that I was creating had come to a very quick stop. How can you go travel and do all these things with diabetes and be around the world when you're going to be tethered to a doctor or you're going to be tethered to these health issues? So once again, all these misconceptions about diabetes that I had were fueling this fear, and I didn't have any facts at that point. So I spent the next 2-3 weeks just diving into what is this, and I was very ignorant at that point. And so for those uninitiated, type 2 diabetes is insulin resistance. It's stereotypically, and I say that strongly, it's not completely true, that it typically comes with a larger body style and a less active lifestyle, but it has a lot to do with genetics and it has a lot to do with other things. Type 2 is insulin resistance, where you're making all the insulin, your body's just not using it right. So you might have to supplement that with insulin. Type 1 diabetes, which is what I have, means my pancreas has stopped producing any insulin. My body won't process food correctly unless I give it insulin, which is why type 1 diabetics have to have insulin, through needles or through an insulin pump. So I was immediately told, you get to manage this thing for the rest of your life, and here's all the scary things that can happen along the way, and you could go blind and you could lose your feet and all these crazy things that can happen with badly managed diabetes. At the beginning of that, you're freaked out. Anyways, so 2 or 3 weeks, one of my friends let me go down to the beach and watch his house while he was away, and that really gave me some time to stop and just decompress and look forward. And then I said, all right, let's figure this thing out, because I just spent 2 or 3 years of my life getting to a point where I want to travel and I want to experience the world and I want to grow from that, and I'm not going to let this stop me. So then it was a matter of just doing the work and starting over and saying, all right, what's the first baby step, and what's the next baby step, and what's the next experiment? That's the backstory. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but you're up to speed now.
Well, yeah, and I just have out of my own curiosity, you're working independently. What does insurance look like for you at that time? How are you navigating that? Because I imagine that has to factor into this somehow too.
Yeah, so I get my insurance through the Affordable Care Act. So to those that haven't used it, you're essentially shopping insurance policies and insurance providers. So I've had my insurance. I've always had insurance. It was a matter of saying, okay, the amount of that insurance and the amount of money that diabetes costs is going to change dramatically, because I wasn't going to the doctor a lot. I was very healthy. And now this is one of those things where most type 1 diabetics would probably tell you you're going to hit your deductible every single year, no matter what, like in January. So I had to learn a lot of new things and switch. That was one of the things I didn't do actually the first year. There's some pretty big articles on my website about navigating a major medical condition, the beginning of it. It doesn't have to be diabetes. It's just this mindset, this brain fog, this zombie mode that happens whenever you have that. And there's some tips on there to, what to do first. And one of those things is get some help talking about your medical insurance, because you don't know what questions you need to ask. And that's where I ran into trouble. Was I was like, well, I got good insurance, I'll be fine. And then I spent a lot of extra money that first year because I didn't have the right insurance for that condition, and I didn't understand what my outlay was going to be financially. So yeah, to answer your question, I use the Affordable Care Act, and I have Blue Cross Blue Shield through North Carolina at the moment, and everything needs to be local. So I still technically live in North Carolina. I just travel the world a lot, and that's kind of my home base. So I go back there very regularly to see my doctors and to get my medications and all those things. But that is a whole nother hurdle for me in the future, is to say, does North Carolina want to be my home base, or do I want another state as my home base, or another country as my home base? A lot of that starts with medical for me.
So then there's a lot of ways you can answer this, and you've kind of touched on a little bit, but how does this present a challenge for you traveling, particularly internationally? I remember when we talked last time, you said that Like, you have to keep your insulin cold, you have to keep it frozen, and if you're traveling on a 6-hour, 7-hour, 8-hour flight, that can present a challenge.
Yeah. So we did speak about this. I have to keep my insulin cold. I can't freeze it. But on my first trip to Portugal, one of the flight attendants froze on accident some of my insulin. So I had literally built up to this Portugal trip, and I was on insulin pens at this time. I'm currently on an insulin pump. One of the things that I wanted to understand for the first year of my diabetes was, how do you manage it manually? How do you understand the disease enough to where, before I automate it with an insulin pump or these newer technologies, I at least know what I'm dealing with. And so I used insulin pens for that first year, and which means, 6, 7 injections of insulin a day whenever I have food, whenever, checking your blood and pricking your fingers as needed. So on this trip to Portugal, I actually had enough insulin pens to last me 3 months, and 2 of those got frozen on the flight over. So one of the things that, we do hear about other countries, though, is that, or let's say, we know about the United States, is that our medical system and our insurance is very expensive. And that's an understatement when talking about diabetes and some of these other conditions. So I knew that going over to Portugal, that Portugal has one of the lowest costs of diabetes in the world, literally, because I did the research, and the United States has the highest. So I knew that, in theory, based on my research, I could get insulin. And we talked about this, or we wanted to talk about this. There's also this idea that, I think whenever we have a major cataclysmic thing happen in our lives, that we're the only ones having those feelings. We're the only ones dealing with those things. And we shut down to the reality that, like, every place in the world is dealing with these medical conditions. They are dealing with them in different ways, for sure. But I know that there are people living in Portugal with type 1 diabetes, and they're thriving, I assume, and their government gives them their insulin for free because they need it to live. It's a novel idea I wish the US would get on board with. So, in finding these things out and kind of getting out of my pit, my what do you call it? My pity party. Oh, woe is me. You have this thing, and now you need to sit in this chair for the rest of your life. Well, no, there are people over there dealing with it. So know that if I get into any troubles, I can probably figure out a way to deal with it there. It may cost me some money. It may cost me some time. It might be hard, but I know that there are people living in Portugal that are dealing with the same condition. So let's start to see what they do about it. And I started doing that research and figured out. So I knew when I hit the ground that I was going to, and this is one of the things I do on my website, is kind of talk about these things. And it's a lot of travel stuff too, but obviously diabetes is part of my life now. So that's part of the conversation. But I just knew going into it that insulin was fairly inexpensive. And okay, now how do I prove that? So I started stopping into pharmacies the minute I got on the ground and just asking questions. So when I got to Porto, I probably stopped into 5 different pharmacies and asked the same questions to make sure that I was getting a valid answer and that there weren't any, like, weird answers. They were all the same. Oh, you need that much insulin? It's $60 US. The amount of insulin that I need to live for a year will cost me $20 in Portugal. It's about $2,000 here in the US. And that's the fact. It's frighteningly sad. So, it really does come down to, once again, getting the misconceptions out of my mind of what diabetes is, what the realities of it are, and then saying, okay, how do other people deal with this in other countries? And what's your backup plan? And what's your backup plan for a backup plan? So I always know that if shit hits the fan and I need to come home, I might have to spend a chunk of money to come home. That's why I have travel medical insurance, but more importantly, that's why I have evacuation insurance. If something happens on the ground, I'm covered at a hospital where I'm at. And if I really need to get home, my evacuation insurance will get me back to North Carolina. Those are the things that I didn't know 3 years ago, but I know them now. And I encourage other people to get those things. And a lot of people don't even know what evacuation insurance is. So, it really is a matter of just figuring out where the gaps are and filling those gaps in and getting comfortable enough to say, okay, I'm comfortable enough to go do this thing. If I got to get home, if I got to, have an out, what are those outs? And shit's going to happen no matter what at some point in your life. You're not going to be able to script when stuff goes wrong. You just kind of got to be ready for, prepare for the worst, hope for the best, I guess.
So we'll get you out of here on this. What has this diagnosis of type 1 diabetes taught you about yourself? What has your experiment mindset taught you as well as you look forward to the second half of life?
So I think one of the things I definitely want to mention about the diagnosis is a major dose. I don't know if dose is the right word, but of empathy. And I'm an empath. Like I feel, I feel a lot, and I try and take that into my interactions with other people. But what the process of losing my eyesight for a couple of weeks and literally not being able to drive comfortably because I couldn't see, and I have perfect vision, like perfect vision. And I went from being able to see to two or 3 days later, I couldn't see 50 feet in front of me. Losing that weight, not understanding why I was tired all the time, it reinforced the fact that there are so many people around us. Every single solitary person around you is dealing with things that you can't see. It might be emotional, it might be physical, it might be medical, but they are dealing with something, and that's affecting their day, it's affecting their mood, it's affecting their actions. And whenever I was going through that initial diagnosis, it really opened my eyes to those types of things. So, for instance, one of my buddies, he wears glasses, and he's got two different pairs of glasses because he's got his readers and he's got his other glasses. And I used to poke him a little bit about it, oh, you got your right glasses on, or, little guy jokes or whatever you want to call it. And even that little thing now is something that I will not do, because that, number one, that was an asshole move for me in the beginning. But, I realized that, number one, that's not something that he has control over. It's something that affects his life that I had no idea what it's like to have, bad vision or to deal with those types of things. And so that gave me that perspective. The same thing with somebody who's, dealing with emotional, anxiety, depression. Like, I went through all those phases with these things, and it really opened my eyes to the fact that we need to have a lot more patience with those around us, because they don't need to explain to us why they're having a bad day. Life can be tough. So yeah, that big dose of empathy is something that I try to, weave into my day more than I was before this diagnosis, because I think we're always trying to grow and be better people, but my eyes were open to that. As far as moving forwards, things just got a lot more complicated. That's just the way it's going to be for a while. I want to experience different countries in the world, so there's just a lot more research. There's a lot more kind of give and take. So I travel carry-on only. That was hard before. I literally have almost a cubic square foot of diabetes, durable medical supplies that I need to take for 3 months and living in another country. That's not realistic. So, there's just all this push and pull and things to figure out. And the other thing is, kind of like what we talked about earlier, is life is long in front of us. I'm 44 years old. I still like to believe I got another 30 or 40 years on this big old ball. And what's the rush? So while I do want to get out there and do those things, while I don't want to stagnate, I don't have to be broken, mentally or emotionally, because I can't do them as quickly as I want to do them anymore. I just got to make sure that I keep doing them. And I think that's back to that stagnation and progress over perfection, but always progress idea and mentality, is keep moving towards that goal. Take breaks when you need it, but don't let those breaks towards that goal become weeks, months, years, because that's when we look back and go, wait, what happened? How did I miss that? How did I waste so much time not really pushing myself? So,
Well, before we started talking here, you and I talked about just this idea of slow and steady wins the race. And I feel like if you're going to experiment, it's going to be a slow, but it needs to be a steady process as you try and figure things out. And you need to embrace failure, and you need to embrace trying new things and putting yourself out there from time to time. So, Jason, I really appreciate you taking the time here to chat with us today. And for those of you interested in checking out Jason's book, The Beginner Traveler's Guide to Going Nomad, you can go to www.thenomadexperiment.com. You can check out Jason on Instagram at the Nomad Experiment as well. Thanks for being here, Jason. I really appreciate it.
it's been a blast. Glad we finally got to do this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Catch you somewhere in the world, hopefully sometime soon. Maybe you come to Seoul.
There you go. I'm working my way west.
Fantastic. So for Jason, this is Billy. Thank you for listening to the Mindful Midlife Crisis. May you feel happy, healthy, and loved. Take care, friends. Thank you for taking the time to listen to the Mindful Midlife Crisis podcast. We hope you enjoyed this week's episode. If this episode resonates with you, please share it with your family and friends. We will do our best to put out new content every Wednesday to get you over the midweek hump. If you want episodes to be downloaded automatically to your phone each week, all you need to do is hit the check mark, subscribe, like, or follow button, depending on what podcast format you're using. While you're at it, feel free to leave our show a quick 5-star review with a few kind words so more people like you can easily find our show. If you're really enjoying the show and you want to help us out, feel free to make a donation to www.buymeacoffee.com/MMC podcast. That's www.buymeacoffee.com/MMC podcast. You can also access the link in our show notes. We use the money from these donations to pay whatever expenses we incur from producing the show, but ultimately, we record this show for you. So if you keep listening, we'll keep recording and releasing new episodes each week regardless. If you'd like to contact us, or if you have suggestions about what you'd like us to discuss on future episodes, feel free to email us at mindfulmidlifecrisis@gmail.com or follow us on Instagram at mindful_midlife_crisis. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to the articles and resources we reference throughout the show. Thanks again for listening. May you feel happy, healthy, and loved.